Rachel Carter did not know that the millionaire watched her arrive by city transit every single day, until one brisk morning he stopped her and said something that immediately captured all of her attention. Rachel recognized the handsome man in the tailored gray suit the exact instant he planted himself firmly in front of her on the bustling streets of Chicago, and her heart skipped a beat that was not remotely romantic, but purely born of intense alarm. He was the one, the very same man who had spent many weeks watching her step off the massive public vehicle every morning, always standing on the exact same corner in front of the towering glass corporate building, with his hands casually resting in his pockets, and a heavy gaze that she had learned to feel on the back of her neck, even when she desperately pretended not to notice his presence. Rachel was certainly not a foolish woman for a woman who travels entirely alone on public transit. At exactly 7 in the morning, inevitably develops a finely tuned sixth sense for men who stare a little too much. For many long days she had carried the deep, suffocating discomfort of knowing she was being quietly observed without understanding the reason why, having considered all the frightening possibilities, none of them remotely good. A relentless stalker, a stranger with dark intentions, or someone simply waiting for the perfect moment to approach her. For that specific reason, when that morning the man finally took the decisive step and blocked her path just as she descended to the pavement, with her portfolio pressed tightly against her chest, the very first thing Rachel felt was neither curiosity nor flattery, but the overwhelming primal instinct to protect herself from imminent harm. She stopped dead in her tracks, tightened her grip on the worn leather strap of her shoulder bag, and looked at him with that serene, unbreakable caution of someone who absolutely refuses to be intimidated, but who is also not actively looking to start a public fight. She asked him in a firm, highly educated voice if he needed something, making it abundantly clear, in her icy tone, that this was by no means an open invitation to chat casually, but a direct, unyielding question from a woman who simply wanted to understand what was happening and continue on her way as quickly as possible. The man, far from seeming uncomfortable or defensive, appeared to suddenly realize exactly how the entire situation must have looked from her vulnerable perspective, and something in his rigid expression softened immensely, as if he had never once calculated that for weeks he had been appearing as the exact kind of creeping threat she rightfully feared. He apologized profusely first and foremost, telling her gently that he completely understood that his lingering behavior must have seemed incredibly strange and even deeply worrying, and that he truly regretted causing her any distress whatsoever. Then he finally introduced himself properly, and it was right at that precise moment that Rachel's entire world shifted into a completely different, and for a brief second, even more deeply uncomfortable alignment. He told her in a steady, resonant voice that his name was Samuel Anderson, and that he was the primary owner of the massive corporate enterprise where she currently worked, a revelation that hit her like a sudden blast of the freezing city wind. Rachel absolutely recognized that powerful name without a single shadow of a doubt, as it appeared constantly in the weekly corporate emails, on the shiny bronze plaques in the grand lobby, and on the glowing screens of the boardrooms to which she, a simple employee from the 12th floor, without any important executive title, had never once been invited. Samuel Anderson was the wealthy man everyone talked about in hushed, reverent whispers, the elusive owner whom almost no one had ever seen up close, a figure much closer to an urban myth than to the daily reality of the ordinary people who spent their waking hours filling out endless spreadsheets. And this incredibly powerful man, the absolute owner of the entire glass empire, had spent weeks deliberately watching her step off a standard public bus, a fact that sent a cold shiver of absolute dread straight down her spine. The new information, instead of bringing her any peace of mind, instantly triggered every single internal alarm she possessed, Because it was one thing to have a strange anonymous man loitering on the corner, and something entirely different to have the most powerful man in the company inexplicably fixating on an ordinary low-level employee. Rachel, who had unfortunately learned the absolute hard way that immense power rarely pays attention to someone like her without expecting something heavy and compromising, in return felt her deep protective caution multiply exponentially within her chest. She did not act dazzled, she did not stutter out of false flattery, nor did she melt into sweet, accommodating smiles, as he perhaps expected any standard employee to do when faced with the wealthy, influential owner of their livelihood. Rachel simply looked at him with a highly distrustful calm, and asked him with firm respect, but without beating around the bush, in the slightest exactly why he had been observing her for so many consecutive days. She stated clearly that she had spent weeks feeling actively watched, and that she rightfully deserved an honest, straightforward explanation for his unsettling, persistent behavior right there on the sidewalk. The sheer bluntness of her direct question seemed to take Samuel completely by surprise, as it was blindingly evident that he was far more accustomed to people smiling blindly and agreeing with his every word than to a woman demanding strict accountability from him on a public street corner at 7 in the morning. He told her with striking sincerity that she was absolutely right to ask, and that he definitely owed her a completely honest answer regarding his seemingly bizarre actions over the past weeks. Samuel explained that he had initially noticed her entirely by chance weeks ago, one cold morning when his private driver had dropped him off in front of the massive building, and he had witnessed her step off the bus and cross the bustling street, deliberately stopping to help an elderly woman carry her heavy shopping bags up the steep curb before continuing on her way. He said that this small, quiet gesture had permanently etched itself into his memory, because, in his isolated world of boardrooms and financial figures, it had been a very long time since he had seen someone do something genuinely kind without a camera or a watchful boss present. Rachel listened to that entire explanation without lowering her emotional guard even a fraction of an inch, because beautiful poetic words were precisely the weapon life had taught her to distrust the absolute most. She thanked him for his honesty with a crisp professional courtesy that did not concede a single millimeter of familiar ground, and told him softly but firmly that she was just an ordinary employee coming to work, that she did not seek to attract anyone's attention, much less that of the company owner. She explicitly stated that she sincerely hoped this highly unusual encounter would not bring her any misunderstandings or terrible problems at her job, because that modest employment cost her a great deal of effort to maintain, and she desperately needed the regular income to survive. That last sentence, delivered without any theatrical drama, but carrying a heavy, undeniable truth, briefly revealed the immense invisible weight of everything Rachel constantly carried on her tired shoulders. The relentless daily struggle catching the transit vehicle at 7 in the morning, meticulously calculating her tight monthly bills, and the fierce, unyielding pride of supporting herself entirely alone without owing a single favor to anyone in the world. Samuel, who was highly trained in reading people during intense high-stakes business negotiations, immediately captured that profound truth and understood that the woman standing before him was not just another face, but someone who had earned every single thing she possessed through sheer willpower, and that her intense distrust was not arrogance, but the necessary armor of someone who had been forced to protect herself. He assured her with a solemn seriousness designed specifically to bring her comfort that she would absolutely not face any problems whatsoever, that her position on the 12th floor was completely safe, and that he would never under any circumstances use his corporate power to make her feel uncomfortable. He promised that if she simply wished it, they could entirely forget this sidewalk conversation ever happened, and he would never again wait for her on that windy city corner. He spoke those words with genuine conviction, and Rachel instinctively noticed his sincerity, which prompted her to lower her defensive guard just a tiny fraction, just enough to give a small nod, and softly tell him that she truly appreciated his respectful understanding. But right before she could continue her path toward the towering glass entrance, Samuel did something that completely threw her off balance and interrupted her practiced morning rhythm. He asked her, without any applying pressure, to allow him to at least know her first name, not speaking as the supreme owner to a subordinate employee, but simply as one equal human being to another, because he had spent weeks inventing silent stories about a stranger, and he would genuinely love to finally put a real name to her face. Rachel hesitated for a long, heavy second, that specific second where self-preservation and simple humanity intersect. And ultimately, because refusing would have been far ruder than the situation truly warranted, she simply told him her name was Rachel, offering absolutely nothing more. That particular day, Rachel worked just like any other ordinary day, but deep inside her mind, she simply could not stop turning that unexpected encounter over and over again. At her tidy desk on the 12th floor, completely surrounded by towering stacks of spreadsheets and the constant dull murmur of typing keyboards, she caught herself more than once with her gaze lost out the window, meticulously reviewing every single word the wealthy owner had spoken to her. She absolutely refused to allow herself to get even slightly excited, because harboring romantic illusions was an incredibly expensive luxury that simply did not fit anywhere into her meticulously planned monthly budget. Rachel had painstakingly built her entire life based on the firm principle of expecting absolutely nothing from anyone having arrived in the sprawling city of Chicago many years ago with only a single battered suitcase and an ironclad determination to succeed. She had tirelessly studied late into the night, while working grueling shifts during the day, personally paying every single penny of her own college tuition, and had learned through painful experience that things presenting themselves as free gifts almost always ended up carrying a devastatingly high hidden price. Therefore, when a tiny, quiet voice inside her tried to feel flattered that the most powerful man in the building had noticed her, she silenced it immediately with the cold rationality of someone who simply cannot afford the luxury of making a catastrophic mistake. What Rachel did not know, while she fiercely forced herself to forget the morning encounter and aggressively concentrate on her columns of financial numbers, was that on the exact opposite side of the towering building, in the highest, most luxurious office of all, Samuel Anderson was also completely failing to concentrate. The powerful man, who had extremely important meetings with wealthy investors and million-dollar decisions waiting patiently on his grand mahogany desk, found himself constantly thinking about an ordinary employee from the 12th floor who had looked him dead in the eyes without a single ounce of sycophancy and demanded clear explanations in the middle of the street. Samuel was acutely aware of the massive, intimidating distance that existed between them, and he knew it was not exclusively about the staggering difference in their bank accounts. He knew with absolute certainty that he was the owner, and she was a vulnerable employee, and he fully understood that any further approach could be horribly misinterpreted, that improperly used power causes deep wounds, and that the very last thing he ever wanted was to become one of those awful men who confuse authority with the right to harass someone who depends on their paycheck. For that profound reason, he silently promised himself that if he truly wanted to earn even a fraction of this remarkable woman's trust, he would have to do it flawlessly with absolute respect, never weaponizing his position, and always leaving the ultimate control of their boundaries entirely in her capable hands. Samuel strictly kept his solemn word, and surprisingly, that was perhaps the thing that completely disconcerted Rachel the absolute most over the following days. He never again waited for her on that windy city corner He did not summon her to his luxurious top-floor office, and he absolutely refused to use any of the 1,000 different ways a powerful man could have easily pressured a vulnerable employee who had caught his eye. During the subsequent mornings, Rachel arrived on her transit vehicle at 7, fully expecting to find him there, mentally prepared to firmly establish her professional boundaries once more, and instead she found the bustling sidewalk completely empty. While a highly rational part of her brain felt a profound sense of relief at his absence, another hidden part, one she fiercely refused to acknowledge out loud, caught herself glancing toward the pavement every single morning with a sinking feeling that suspiciously resembled genuine disappointment. Rachel harshly scolded herself for that dangerous feeling, repeatedly telling herself that it was infinitely better this way, that the absolute last thing she needed in her meticulously ordered life was to deeply complicate it with the owner of the company. She aggressively forced herself to concentrate solely on her complex financial spreadsheets, but the tiny, stubborn seed of genuine curiosity had already been permanently planted in her mind. The very next approach did not happen out on the cold street, but in the most delightfully unexpected and entirely harmless location possible, the bustling building cafeteria, right in the middle of the morning. Rachel went down at her usual time to grab a simple cup of coffee before returning to her demanding numerical tasks, and to her utter shock, Samuel was standing right there, patiently waiting in the regular line, just like any other ordinary employee. Completely without his usual entourage of eager assistants, simply waiting his turn to order a drink. Rachel noticed his tall figure immediately and seriously debated turning around to flee, but he simply greeted her with a highly polite, entirely unpressured nod of his head, making it abundantly clear through his restrained body language that he had absolutely no intention of invading her personal space. It was Rachel herself, much to her own profound surprise, who ultimately ended up getting in the line directly behind him, realizing that running away would have been a silent admission of fear, and Rachel Carter was absolutely not afraid of anyone or anything. They briefly exchanged a few highly trivial words about the roasted coffee and the unpredictable Chicago weather, but Rachel immediately noticed a small detail that completely threw her off balance. The wealthy owner of the entire company actually knew the first name of Martha, the hard-working older woman who ran the cafeteria register. He warmly asked Martha about her son's recent graduation and joked with her with a fluid, genuine naturalness that simply cannot be successfully faked by an arrogant man. From that revealing moment onward, their brief encounters became delightfully casual, but increasingly frequent, always occurring in strictly neutral territory, with Samuel consistently taking extreme care never to make her feel cornered or pressured in any professional capacity. They coincidentally met in the long cafeteria line in the crowded morning elevator or near the grand glass entrance of the building, and very slowly, their highly trivial conversations seamlessly evolved into discussions of profound substance. Rachel quickly discovered that Samuel did not fit into the rigid, arrogant mold she had previously constructed for him. He never spoke about his massive wealth. He never boasted about his achievements. He never dropped inappropriate hints, nor did he ever attempt to impress her with his supreme corporate position. Instead, Samuel spoke passionately about classic literature, the hidden architectural history of the city, and complex philosophical ideas. But above all else, he truly listened to her with a deeply focused attention that Rachel found incredibly rare and immensely pleasant. Very few times in her difficult life had anyone possessing such immense power genuinely bothered to listen to what she actually had to say, without an ulterior motive. And yet, Rachel still absolutely refused to lower her defensive guard entirely. Every single time she caught herself truly enjoying one of their deep conversations, a stern inner voice immediately reminded her of exactly who he was, and exactly who she was reinforcing the dangerous reality of their situation. One quiet afternoon, Samuel carefully proposed something that severely tested every ounce of her deeply ingrained mistrust and fiercely independent nature. He gently told her that he was personally aware of an excellent position opening very soon in another department, a significantly better-paying role that perfectly matched the brilliant analytical capacity he had recognized in her and offered to officially recommend her for the job. He offered this completely in good faith, genuinely wanting to help her advance her career. But Rachel, instead of expressing enthusiastic gratitude, instantly grew completely tense and rigid. She responded with a serene but unbreakable firmness, telling him clearly that she vastly preferred he do no such thing under any circumstances. She meticulously explained that if she ever received a promotion in her life, she desperately needed it to be entirely because of her own hard work and undeniable merit, and absolutely not because of a personal recommendation from the supreme owner. She stated without a trace of arrogance, but without a single second of hesitation, that she could not possibly bear the crushing thought of her colleagues, or worse herself, believing she had achieved success through anything other than her own sweat and tears, and Samuel, instead of acting offended, looked at her with a profound, newfound reverence. What Rachel began to truly understand very much to her own deep chagrin was that Samuel was absolutely not trying to buy her affection, nor was he attempting to dazzle her with his immense wealth, nor did he want to place her in his perpetual debt. What he genuinely sought, although neither of them was brave enough to explicitly say it out loud just yet, was simply the quiet joy of being near her, to truly know the depths of her mind, and to slowly earn a sacred place in her trust at whatever cautious speed she felt comfortable allowing. That incredible patience, that entirely voluntary renunciation of using the vast intimidating power he held over her, slowly began to chip away at Rachel's heavy emotional armor far more effectively than any expensive gift or showering of excessive flattery ever could. Rachel, who was intimately accustomed to fiercely defending herself from people who actively wanted to use her for their own gain, simply did not know exactly how to defend herself against a man who only seemed to want to profoundly respect her boundaries. Without fully realizing what was happening, she actually started to eagerly anticipate those casual accidental encounters, deliberately scanning the bustling cafeteria for the familiar sight of Samuel's tailored gray suit. She began saving up small, amusing anecdotes from her daily routine, knowing exactly which details would coax a genuine warm laugh from his lips, and every single time she caught herself doing this, she would aggressively scold herself all over again. Her daily reality, however, remained exactly the same as it had always been, and she absolutely refused to let herself forget that grounding fact for even a single passing moment. She continued catching the crowded transit vehicle at exactly 7 in the morning. She continued meticulously balancing her tight budget at the end of every payment cycle. And she continued returning completely alone to her small, modest apartment where absolutely no one was waiting for her. And that grounded reality, far from causing her any deep shame, was precisely her strongest anchor, the very thing that kept her feet firmly planted on solid earth whenever her treacherous heart threatened to foolishly elevate into the clouds. One dark, chilly night while riding back to her small apartment on an almost completely empty bus, Rachel finally allowed herself to think about Samuel with absolute unfiltered honesty for the very first time, and the startling truth she discovered deeply terrified her. She realized with a heavy, sinking feeling that she actually liked him. She genuinely liked the man himself. Absolutely not his massive wealth or his intimidating corporate power, but the simple, kind man who patiently waited in line just like anyone else, and took the time to learn Martha's name. She felt profoundly frightened because she knew exactly how dangerous it was for an ordinary working woman like her to allow herself to develop genuine romantic feelings for a man holding that level of supreme power. Samuel, entirely on his own side of the sprawling city, was actively fighting his very own complex internal battle regarding their delicate, unspoken connection. He clearly noticed that Rachel was slowly beginning to trust him. He saw it in the way her verbal responses were becoming significantly less sharp, in how she occasionally initiated their casual conversations, and in how the fierce protective distrust in her beautiful eyes had softened noticeably. But he also knew with absolute certainty that a single careless misstep, just one foolish gesture that made her feel he was attempting to weaponize his authority or purchase her affection, would instantly demolish months of careful patience in a single unrecoverable instant. The subtle unspoken dance between them took a highly unexpected turn one gloomy afternoon when they coincidentally ran into each other at the exposed transit stop without any prior planning. Samuel had left the towering building slightly early and was walking briskly toward his waiting private car when he suddenly spotted Rachel standing alone at the bus stop under a dark, threatening Chicago sky that heavily promised imminent freezing rain. Instead of simply driving past her in the warm comfort of his luxurious vehicle, he instructed his private driver to immediately pull over to the side of the bustling street. He stepped out of the expensive car entirely by himself and slowly approached her, notably not offering her a ride home, which he knew would have been far too overwhelming an offer for her fierce independence, but simply offering to stand quietly beside her in the freezing wind until her delayed bus finally arrived. Rachel's immediate, deeply ingrained reflex was to firmly refuse his company, but something about the profound, unpretentious simplicity of his humble gesture stopped the rejection in her throat, and for the very first time she accepted his quiet presence without hastily erecting a massive emotional wall between them. They stood completely together at the chilly stop, while the frantic city hurried wildly around them, and for a few beautiful suspended minutes there was absolutely no corporate owner and no subordinate employee, just two equal people softly conversing under the first freezing drops of rain. When Rachel's delayed transit vehicle finally appeared in the distant gloom, and she quickly said goodbye and climbed aboard, Samuel remained completely still on the wet pavement, watching her depart. But this time, Rachel allowed herself to look back at him through the foggy, rain-streaked glass window, and both of them instantly knew that everything had permanently changed. That brief, heavy look through the foggy transit window fundamentally altered something incredibly profound in the daily routine of both individuals, permanently shifting the invisible ground beneath their feet. They absolutely did not suddenly become wildly close or foolishly skip over the necessary stages of building trust. Rachel remained inherently cautious, and Samuel remained meticulously respectful of her space. But now there was a crackling, undeniable current flowing between them that neither of them bothered to fully deny anymore. They actively sought each other out in the crowded lobby. Their daily conversations in the busy cafeteria stretched significantly longer, and their eyes lingered on one another for just a second more than was strictly professional. It was precisely their shared profound sense of isolation, the quiet reality of two people who were deeply accustomed to fiercely supporting themselves entirely alone, that truly began to unite them in a beautiful way, where massive financial wealth played absolutely no role whatsoever. Rachel constantly found herself wondering if perhaps just maybe she had been entirely wrong about her harsh prejudices, regarding him, slowly realizing that not all powerful men wanted to maliciously consume her, and that this specific man seemingly just wanted the privilege of knowing her soul. But exactly when she started to fully allow herself that comforting thought, her old, deeply ingrained prudence violently stabbed her with the most uncomfortable, terrifying question imaginable. What if she was making a catastrophic mistake by lowering her defensive guard? And what if this entire situation ended up exactly as her difficult life had constantly warned her it would? That terrible, heavy uncertainty kept her constantly on edge, trapped painfully between the overwhelming desire to finally trust another human being and the paralyzing, icy fear of doing so. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to her internal torment, an insidious, dark shadow was quietly gathering massive strength right on the bustling 12th floor, where Rachel worked so incredibly hard every single day. Someone in the busy office, it was never entirely clear exactly who started, it had maliciously begun to whisper highly toxic rumors about the sudden subtle changes in her daily behavior. The professional looks of certain colleagues grew noticeably colder. The hushed gossip abruptly stopped whenever she walked past their cubicles, and one terrible afternoon, a particularly vicious co-worker named Chloe, hiding her cruelty behind a mask of fake concern, blatantly told Rachel that everyone was saying she was sleeping with the wealthy owner to secure an unearned promotion. Rachel instantly felt as though the solid floor beneath her desk had violently ripped open to swallow her whole. This devastating rumor was exactly the absolute worst nightmare she had actively feared since the very first day Samuel approached her on that windy street corner. The horrifying thought that her highly respected professional name, which she had painstakingly built through years of exhausting, strictly honest labor, would be violently reduced to cheap, dirty office gossip, completely shattered her heart. The most agonizing part of the entire terrible ordeal was that she could not even fully defend herself against the accusations, because while the malicious rumor of an unearned promotion was entirely false, the growing, undeniable affection between her and the owner was absolutely true. That very same afternoon, Rachel confronted Samuel in his pristine office with a level of raw, breathless anguish that he had never once seen in her beautiful eyes before. She absolutely did not yell at him because she rationally knew he was not directly responsible for the toxic cruelty of her jealous colleagues, but she confessed her deepest, darkest fears to him with a heartbreaking, brutal honesty. She told him, her voice shaking with intense emotion, that her hard-earned dignity and her clean professional reputation were the only valuable things she truly owned in this world, and she was absolutely not willing to let cruel people believe she had acquired her success in the owner's bed. Samuel listened to her passionate, painful outburst without interrupting her for a single second, his own heart painfully shrinking in his chest, as he finally understood the massive, terrible dimension of what loving him was truly costing her. He realized that Rachel did not need his expensive jewelry, his luxurious vacations, or his massive fortune. She desperately needed something infinitely more difficult for a highly powerful man to provide. She needed him to actively, fiercely protect her professional dignity exactly as if it were his very own. The decisive response Samuel provided to her desperate plea was the specific action that finally permanently won Rachel's heavily guarded heart, achieving this not with empty, beautiful words, but with an astonishing, unprecedented sacrifice. The very next morning, without warning her beforehand, Samuel personally marched directly down to the Human Resources Department and executed an action that no wealthy, powerful man, accustomed to always getting his way, would ever willingly do. He legally and formally completely removed himself from any professional chain of command regarding Rachel Carter signing binding documents dictating that any future performance evaluation, salary raises, or career decisions concerning her must be handled strictly by an independent external committee without his involvement whatsoever. When Rachel discovered this incredible sacrifice, learning about it not from him trying to brag, but through an official dry corporate email from the department, she went directly to him and kissed him for the very first time, finally letting go of her paralyzing fear. The beautiful, highly delicate days immediately following that profound, barrier-breaking kiss felt to Rachel exactly like cautiously walking completely barefoot across an entirely new, undiscovered landscape, simultaneously intensely thrilling and deeply terrifying. She absolutely did not foolishly throw herself recklessly into Samuel's waiting arms, all at once, choosing instead to remain her usual highly careful, grounded self, strictly continuing to catch the early transit vehicle at exactly 7 in the morning. She meticulously performed her demanding numerical work with the exact same fierce dedication as she always had, as if desperately wanting to definitively prove to herself, far more than to anyone else, that finally falling deeply in love had not fundamentally changed the core of who she was. To Samuel, far from finding her stubborn independence annoying or frustrating, this strict adherence to her established routine only made him fall infinitely deeper in love with her. He profoundly understood that her fierce, unyielding determination to remain entirely true to herself was exactly the beautiful quality that made her so incredibly different from every single opportunistic person who had previously surrounded him, seeking access to his vast wealth. They quietly continued seeing each other outside of the towering glass building with the utmost respectful discretion, not because there was anything shameful to hide, but because Rachel fiercely insisted on meticulously protecting her hard-earned professional standing and her personal dignity before her watching colleagues. Their blossoming relationship slowly and beautifully grew entirely in private, patiently constructed from long wandering walks through the bustling city streets and incredibly deep late-night conversations. However, Rachel strictly maintained her absolute refusal to ever let Samuel use his massive wealth to pay for her expenses, an ongoing dynamic that slowly evolved into a quiet, deeply respectful game between the two completely different individuals. Whenever they went out together, she fiercely insisted on paying her exact half of the bill. Whenever he attempted to surprise her with an expensive, luxurious gift, she firmly but affectionately rejected it with a warm, unyielding smile that brooked absolutely no argument. She absolutely did not enforce these strict boundaries out of a foolish, misplaced sense of pride, but because she profoundly understood that her hard-won financial independence was the vital anchor that kept her from losing her true self. Samuel, demonstrating immense emotional intelligence, slowly and beautifully, learned exactly how to love her in her very own unique language, completely abandoning his previous instincts to dazzle her with his limitless financial resources. He quickly learned that for Rachel, the ultimate, most profound luxury was not sitting in an incredibly expensive, exclusive restaurant, but simply having him sit quietly beside her on a worn wooden bench in a public Chicago park, peacefully watching the late afternoon sun fade away. The ultimate, most terrifying test that life had silently prepared for their growing love arrived abruptly in the form of an elegant, highly exclusive invitation that Rachel simply could not reject without deeply hurting Samuel's feelings. The massive corporate enterprise was preparing to lavishly celebrate its major anniversary with an incredibly opulent evening gala, exactly the type of extravagant high society event attended exclusively by wealthy investors, powerful corporate partners, and the elite members of Samuel's privileged world. Samuel gently asked her, explicitly clarifying that he was asking strictly as a man deeply in love and not as her supreme boss, to accompany him as his official partner for the evening, openly standing by his side in front of absolutely everyone. For Samuel, making this public appearance together was an entirely natural, completely logical next step in their relationship. The perfect way to definitively stop hiding his profound feelings and proudly show the watching world that the brilliant woman he had chosen was absolutely not a secret to be ashamed of. For Rachel, however, this terrifying prospect felt exactly like jumping out of an airplane without a parachute directly into the very center of her worst nightmares, an enormous, glittering ballroom packed completely full of incredibly wealthy people who would undoubtedly look down their noses at her. She agonizingly feared they would all cruelly whisper about exactly what the lowly employee from the 12th floor was doing, clinging to the wealthy owner's arm, thereby seemingly confirming every single vicious rumor she had fought so hard to destroy. She was incredibly close to outright refusing the terrifying invitation, but then her mind immediately flashed back to the incredible selfless sacrifice Samuel had voluntarily made by legally surrendering his corporate power strictly to protect her professional dignity. She profoundly realized that refusing to attend simply because she was deeply afraid of the wealthy elite's judgment would be a terrible betrayal of the immense, beautiful trust they had painstakingly built together over the past several months. Therefore, with her racing heart clutched tightly in her trembling hands, she took a deep, shaky breath, looked him directly in his hopeful eyes, and bravely told him that she would proudly attend the grand event as his partner. When the highly anticipated day of the opulent gala finally arrived, a small but incredibly significant battle of wills was affectionately fought regarding exactly how she would present herself to his intimidating world. Samuel, acting with the absolute best, most generous intentions imaginable, had gently offered to completely pay for a breathtakingly expensive designer gown, wanting to lavishly treat her to something mathematically equal to the extreme wealth present at the exclusive event. Rachel, maintaining the exact same serene firmness she always possessed, rejected his generous financial offer with deep affection, firmly stating she would wear a modest, simple dress, purchased entirely with her own hard-earned money, refusing to enter that ballroom disguised as someone she absolutely was not. At the corporate gala, Rachel entered with quiet confidence despite the judgmental stares of wealthy guests who looked down on her humble background. When the feared investor, Mr. Harrison, publicly questioned her career, expecting to embarrass her, Rachel calmly admitted that she had built her life through hard work, paid for her education with night shifts, and was proud of every honest dollar she had earned. Her sincerity earned Mr. Harrison's admiration and instantly changed how everyone viewed her. Samuel, deeply proud of her courage, later listened as Rachel confessed that confronting her greatest fear had finally taught her that her difficult past was not a source of shame, but the foundation of her strength. In return, Samuel revealed that he had also grown up in poverty before wealth transformed his life, and together they visited each other's childhood homes, strengthening their love through honesty, mutual respect, and a shared appreciation for the values that shaped them. Soon afterward, Samuel proposed at the same public transit stop where they had first met, choosing simplicity over extravagance, and Rachel joyfully accepted. They planned a small, intimate wedding that reflected their true selves rather than Samuel's wealth. Rachel walked down the aisle alone with quiet dignity, surrounded by genuine friends instead of powerful business figures. After the ceremony, Samuel surprised her not with a limousine, but with a decorated city bus, honoring the place where he had first fallen in love with her. As they rode through Chicago together, Rachel realized that true dignity comes from remaining authentic, not from wealth or status, and that lasting love celebrates a person's struggles instead of hiding them. Their journey proved that genuine happiness is built on honesty, respect, courage, and the willingness to trust another person, reminding us that life's greatest blessings often begin in the most ordinary places.